Imagine standing on a granite shelf barely 12 feet above the churning Atlantic, where waves regularly crash 40 feet overhead, and the nearest dry land is 3 miles of killing water away. Now imagine being trapped there for months at a time, responsible for keeping a light burning that ships depend on to avoid death in the darkness below. This is Devil's Teeth Lighthouse. Built in 1873 for the equivalent of £4 million in today's money, it was engineered to withstand hurricane-force winds exceeding 160 kilometers per hour. The tower could survive anything the ocean threw at it. The men inside could not survive the tower. Over 21 years of operation, Devil's Teeth consumed lighthouse keepers at a rate that would be considered criminal today. The average tenure was 4 months and 12 days before psychological breakdown, abandonment, or worse. 47 men were treated for what physicians called quotouo. 8 attempted suicide, 3 succeeded, all to keep a light burning that saved ships but slowly destroyed the souls assigned to tend it. The official records buried these casualties as personnel failures rather than system failures. The human cost was classified, filed away, and eventually forgotten. But the pattern it established, the subordination of human welfare to technological achievement, became embedded in how we think about dangerous work even today. Today, we're opening the files on a machine that was designed to conquer darkness, but became expert at extinguishing human beings instead. This is the forensic autopsy of engineering without empathy, where control conquered nature, but could not master the human mind. If you're ready to explore the true cost of progress, measured in human suffering, then stay with me as we descend into the psychological hell of Devil's Teeth Lighthouse, where the light always burned, but the men who kept it burning were slowly consumed by the very system they were meant to serve. The sound you're hearing now is not thunder. It's the North Atlantic, 200 miles off the coast of Ireland, where the water turns black and ships disappear without explanation. Every 14 months, on average, another vessel would vanish into these currents. The cargo would wash ashore weeks later. The crews never would. In 1873, the British Admiralty received a proposal that would change this calculus forever, not through better ships or safer routes, but through a single tower of stone and iron, planted on a rock shelf that spent half its time underwater. The tower would cost the equivalent of £4 million in today's money. It would require the labor of 300 men working in shifts determined by the tide, and it would demand, once completed, that human beings live inside it, alone, for months at a time, keeping a light burning that could be seen 30 miles away. The light would save ships, but it would slowly destroy the men assigned to keep it alive. This is the story of Tilly Lighthouse, and it begins in darkness. Before the lighthouse, this stretch of sea was known simply as Black Water. The name appears on navigation charts dating back to 1647, when the first recorded merchant vessel ran aground on the submerged reefs that lurk just beneath the surface. The water here moves in 3 directions at once. Cold Arctic currents push south along the continental shelf. Warm Gulf Stream eddies spiral north from the Caribbean. And underneath both, a deep water channel funnels westward toward the Irish coast, carrying with it the debris of every storm that has ever crossed the Atlantic. The result is a hydraulic maze that bends light, confuses compasses, and turns familiar landmarks into illusions. Ships approaching from the south see what appears to be open water until the moment their hulls scrape granite. Vessels coming from the north mistake reflected moonlight for safe harbor. The shoreline itself curves inland at precisely the angle that makes depth perception impossible during the hour before dawn, when most commercial traffic attempted to make landfall. Maritime insurance companies had known about black water for decades. Between 1850 and 1870, Lloyd's of London recorded 43 total losses in this single corridor of sea. Cargo valued at over £700,000 simply vanished. But cargo can be replaced. The 312 lives lost during those same 20 years could not. By 1872, the cost of avoiding black water had become prohibitive. Shipping companies were adding 4 days to transatlantic routes, burning coal they couldn't afford, carrying less freight to compensate for the longer journey. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Either someone would build a lighthouse in the most dangerous place on the Irish coast, or commerce would slowly bleed to death trying to sail around it. The question was not whether to build. The question was where. 3 separate surveys were conducted between April and October of 1872. Each team of engineers returned with the same conclusion. There was no good place for a lighthouse in black water. Every potential site presented problems that bordered on the impossible. The obvious choice was Seal Point, a rocky promontory that jutted into the shipping channel from the mainland. It offered stable ground, easy access for supplies, and clear sightlines in 3 directions. But Seal Point sat in the shadow of Ben Carrick, a 400-foot hill that blocked the lighthouse beam precisely when ships needed it most. During the final approach to harbour, when cargo vessels heavy with transatlantic freight could not easily change course. The engineers' calculations were merciless. A lighthouse on Seal Point would save ships approaching from the south and east, but any vessel coming from the northwest, including the weekly mail packets that carried passengers, would see nothing until it was too late. Offshore placement offered better visibility, but came with its own nightmares. The only stable foundation within 20 miles of the shipping channel was Gull Rock, a granite shelf that rose just 12 feet above mean high tide. During winter storms, waves regularly washed 40 feet over Gull Rock's highest point. More critically, the rock was accessible only during a 6-hour window around low tide, and only when wave heights stayed below 8 feet. The construction estimates were staggering. Building on Gull Rock would require every piece of stone, every iron beam, every bag of mortar to be barged out in small boats, unloaded by hand, and hauled up the rock face using block and tackle. Weather delays would be constant. Supply runs would fail routinely, and once completed, the lighthouse would be cut off from the mainland for days at a time during winter storms. But the engineers' third option was worse than either. Devil's Teeth was a cluster of granite spires located exactly where ships most desperately needed guidance, at the confluence of all 3 currents, where the water turned from blue to black to green in the space of a few hundred yards. The reefs here were submerged at high tide, but sharp enough to tear open iron hulls at low water. Depth soundings revealed an underwater landscape of slots and channels that defied mapping. A lighthouse placed on Devil's Teeth would be visible from any direction of approach. Ships would see it in time to correct course. The beam would reach 30 miles in clear weather, far enough to guide vessels safely around the entire reef complex. From an optical standpoint, Devil's Teeth was perfect. From a human standpoint, it was a death sentence. The largest of the granite spires measured 43 feet across at its widest point and rose 28 feet above high water. There was room for a lighthouse. There was no room for anything else. No space for fuel storage, no space for fresh water cisterns, no space for supply boats to dock safely. The lighthouse keepers would live inside the tower itself, breathing salt spray, sleeping in stone chambers that never dried, tending a light that had to burn every night without fail, or ships would die in the darkness below. The Admiralty's decision was announced on November 15th, 1872, in a single paragraph notice published in the London Gazette. Construction would begin the following spring. The site would be Devil's Teeth. The estimated cost was £87,000, nearly half of which would be spent on the lens assembly alone. No mention was made of the men who would be required to live there. The engineering specifications were drafted during the winter of 1873 by Morrison, Caldwell and Sons, the same firm that had designed lighthouses on the Scottish coast for over 40 years. Their approach was rooted in imperial confidence and mechanical precision. Wind load calculations, foundation depths, material stress tolerances. Every structural element was sized to withstand the worst storms on record, then doubled for safety. The tower would rise 112 feet above the granite base, built from quarried limestone blocks, weighing up to 3 tons each. The walls at the foundation would be 8 feet thick, tapering to 18 inches at the lantern room. Internal floors would be cast iron, supported by wrought iron beams designed to flex during high winds without cracking the masonry. The entire structure would be held together by a central spine of interconnected iron rods that ran from the foundation to the lantern assembly, like the skeleton of some enormous beast. But the heart of the lighthouse was the lens itself. Manufactured by Barbier and Fenestre of Paris, the first order Fresnel lens stood 12 feet tall and weighed over 6 tons when fully assembled. 216 individual glass prisms focused the light of a whale oil flame into a beam that could be seen from the horizon in any weather short of fog. The lens assembly alone cost £38,000, more than most men would earn in a lifetime. By comparison, the living quarters received minimal attention in the specifications. 3 levels of the tower were designated as, quote, one quote, but the drawings showed little more than circular rooms with stone walls and narrow windows. No insulation was specified. No heating system was designed. The chambers were sized to house 2 men, with shared bunks, a common table, and enough storage for a month's worth of supplies. The assumption was simple. Lighthouse keepers were hardy men accustomed to hardship. They would adapt. What the engineers failed to consider was the unique acoustic properties of their design. The spiral staircase that connected each level of the tower was built with iron treads and stone walls to minimize fire risk. But iron and stone together created a resonance chamber. Every footstep echoed, every voice carried. And during storms, when wind moved through the tower at high speed, the stairwell amplified low-frequency sound waves that human ears could barely detect, but human bodies could feel as a constant, subtle vibration. Later, keepers would report that the tower never went silent. Even on calm nights, it hummed. Construction began on April 22, 1873, when the steamship Vigilant departed Cork Harbour, carrying the first crew of masons and their tools. The plan was to work in rotation. Teams of 20 men would stay on Devil's Teeth for 6 days, then return to shore for 4 days of rest while the next crew took over. Weather permitting, work would continue from April through October, when winter storms would make further progress impossible. By the end of the first week, it was clear that weather would permit very little. Devil's Teeth was accessible only during the 6 hours surrounding low tide, and only when wave heights remained below 5 feet. Atlantic weather in spring is notoriously unpredictable. Storms form quickly, last for days, and arrive with little warning. Of the first 30 days of construction, only 11 were calm enough for boats to approach the rock. When work was possible, it proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Crews hauled limestone blocks from the supply barge using a steam-powered winch mounted on a temporary wooden platform. The blocks were shaped and fitted on the spot, since any piece that didn't match perfectly would have to be ferried back to shore for reshaping. Mortar was mixed in small batches to prevent it from curing before it could be used. But the real enemy was not weather. It was time. Each tide cycle gave the crews 6 hours to transport materials, unload them, position them, and retreat before the water rose again. Men worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that every minute lost meant another day before the next attempt. They slept in shifts aboard the supply ship when seas were too rough to return to port. They ate cold meals because there was no time to heat food. They communicated with hand signals because shouting over wind and waves exhausted them too quickly. By midsummer, a pattern had emerged. Progress came in bursts measured in single days, followed by delays measured in weeks. When Atlantic low-pressure systems stalled off the coast, bringing sustained gales and heavy seas, construction stopped entirely. During one stretch in July, crews were unable to approach Devil's Teeth for 19 consecutive days. The delays were expensive in ways that went beyond simple labor costs. The limestone blocks, quarried in Wales and shipped to Ireland in cargo holds, developed hairline cracks when exposed to salt spray for extended periods. Iron fittings rusted, if not immediately sealed. Mortar that had been mixed but unused had to be discarded, along with the time spent preparing it. But Morrison and Caldwell had built their reputation on completing projects that other firms considered impossible. Delays were frustrating, but not fatal. Extra costs were absorbed. Winter schedules were extended into November, despite the risks. The tower would be finished. What could not be absorbed was the human cost of speed. Racing against the tide meant cutting corners that would normally be unthinkable. Mortar was mixed with higher water content, so it would cure faster in salt air, but this made it more porous, more vulnerable to freeze-thaw cycles. Stone blocks were set with thinner mortar joints to save time, but this created stress points where the tower would eventually crack. Safety lines were deemed too time-consuming to rig properly. Men balanced on narrow ledges without protection, because every minute spent securing ropes was a minute not spent building. The first serious injury occurred on August 14th, when a mason named Patrick O'Brien lost his footing while positioning a cornerstone and fell 18 feet onto the granite base. O'Brien survived, but his left leg was shattered below the knee. He was evacuated to Cork, where doctors amputated the limb to prevent infection. The crew returned to work the same day. By November, when winter weather finally forced construction to halt, the tower had reached 60 feet in height. The foundation was solid, the walls were plumb, and the internal iron framework was in place. But close inspection revealed problems that would have been prevented if time had not been the overriding factor. Cracks ran through several of the mortar joints where thermal expansion had caused the limestone blocks to shift. Salt deposits had formed on the internal surfaces where seawater had penetrated gaps in the masonry. Most seriously, the iron framework showed signs of corrosion where it had been exposed to spray during the building process. The spring of 1874 brought renewed effort and the same old problems. Tidal access, weather delays, the relentless pressure to work faster than conditions allowed. But the tower continued to rise, and by September the lantern room was ready to receive the lens assembly. The Fresnel lens arrived from Paris in 18 wooden crates, each piece wrapped in felt and straw. The glass prisms had been individually numbered and mapped so that reassembly would proceed in precise sequence. Even so, installing the lens required 4 weeks of delicate work carried out in weather that was often marginal for boat travel. The lens was beautiful in the way that precision instruments can be beautiful. Each prism had been ground to mathematical exactness, polished to optical clarity, and fitted into bronze frames that positioned them at angles calculated to the arc minute. When assembled, the lens formed a hollow cylinder that stood taller than a man and weighed more than a carriage. At its center, The whale oil flame would burn with the intensity of 1,500 candles, focused into a beam that could pierce 30 miles of Atlantic darkness. But beauty was not the point. Effectiveness was. On October 3rd, 1874, just before sunset, the lighthouse was illuminated for the first time. The beam swept across black water like a blade of light, revealing the treacherous reefs, the shifting currents, the granite teeth that had claimed so many ships. From the deck of the supply ship, 3 miles away, the light was brilliant enough to read by. From the villages along the Irish coast, where wives and mothers had spent decades watching for ships that never returned, the lighthouse looked like a star that had fallen into the sea and decided to stay. The light worked. Ships altered course. The reef-strewn waters that had been a graveyard became a highway. Within 6 months, Lloyd's of London reduced insurance rates for vessels transiting the Blackwater corridor. Within a year, shipping companies were adding extra runs to routes they had previously avoided. The lighthouse had succeeded beyond all expectations. But success created its own problems. A light that operated every night required constant maintenance. The whale oil flame had to be trimmed every 4 hours to prevent smoking. The lens had to be cleaned daily to maintain its brightness. Weather observations had to be recorded at regular intervals and transmitted to the mainland by signal flag or mirror. Supply runs had to be scheduled, managed, and executed regardless of weather. All of this required lighthouse keepers, men willing to live alone on Devil's Teeth for months at a time, tending a machine that could not be allowed to fail. The job posting appeared in newspapers across Ireland in December of 1874. The pay was generous by standards of the day, £30 per year, plus room, board, and medical care. The requirement seemed reasonable: literacy, basic mechanical skills, physical health, and a willingness to work in isolation. What the posting did not mention was that the room was a circular stone chamber, 18 feet across and 8 feet high, with walls that wept constantly, and a single window that faced into the prevailing wind. The board consisted of salted meat, ship's biscuit, and whatever vegetables could survive the journey from shore. The Kasya amounted to a chest of basic supplies and the hope that nothing serious would go wrong when help was days away. More importantly, the posting made no attempt to describe what it felt like to live inside the lighthouse, to hear every footstep echo through the tower, to feel the building sway during storms, to spend weeks at a time with no human contact, except the voice of your partner calling up the stairwell. The first keepers were Patrick Sullivan and James Murphy, both experienced seamen who had worked on merchant vessels for over a decade. They arrived at Devil's Teeth on January 15th, 1875, carrying personal belongings that fit into 2 canvas bags and enough supplies to last 6 weeks. The lighthouse keeper's manual, written by the Board of Trade, was 37 pages long and covered everything from daily maintenance procedures to emergency protocols. What it did not cover was psychology. Sullivan and Murphy were responsible for keeping a light burning that ships depended on for survival. They were isolated on a rock in the middle of the ocean, with no way to communicate with the mainland except during supply runs. They were confined to a tower that offered no privacy, no escape, and no silence. They were expected to function efficiently, maintain detailed logs, and follow procedures exactly, regardless of their personal state of mind. The system was optimized for everything except the men inside it. By spring, both keepers were writing home about the quote 5 in the tower. By summer, their log entries had become terse and mechanical. By autumn, Sullivan was requesting transfer to a mainland position. His replacement, Daniel O'Connor, lasted 3 months before abandoning his post during a supply run and never returning. The lighthouse continued to burn every night. Ships continued to navigate safely through black water. The system worked exactly as designed. But the men responsible for operating the system were slowly being destroyed by it. What the engineers had created was not just a lighthouse, it was a machine for breaking human beings down into component parts: sight, hearing, touch, reason, and then isolating each part until none of them worked properly anymore. The light saved ships, but it consumed the souls of the men who kept it burning. And this was only the beginning. The daily routine of a lighthouse keeper was designed with mechanical precision. Every task had a schedule. Every schedule had a purpose. Every purpose served the light. 4 o'clock in the morning. Climb the iron stairs to the lantern room. Trim the whale oil wick to prevent smoking. Clean soot from the glass chimney. Polish any salt residue from the lens faces. Check the oil reservoir. Wind the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens assembly. Record wind direction, barometric pressure, and visibility in the official log. Descend to the watch room. Eat breakfast from tins that had been opened the night before because cooking required time that interrupted other duties. 6 o'clock. Inventory supplies. Check fuel consumption against delivery schedules. Inspect the tower for signs of damage. Loose stones, corroded iron, water intrusion. Clean the exterior windows if weather permitted. Trim the wick again. Polish the lens again. Record observations again. The rhythm was hypnotic and relentless, like the heartbeat of a machine that never slept. 8 o'clock. Tend the weather monitoring equipment. Read the barometer. Observe cloud formations. Estimate wind speed by watching the behavior of spray on the water. Record everything in precise handwriting that would be reviewed by officials who had never spent a night in a lighthouse. Trim the wick. Check the oil. Polish the glass. The tasks repeated every 4 hours, day and night, without variation or exception. The Board of Trade had calculated that this schedule would ensure optimal light performance while distributing the workload evenly between 2 keepers. What they had not calculated was the psychological impact of a routine so rigid that it eliminated spontaneity, choice, and the basic human freedom to decide how to spend one's time. Every keeper who lasted more than 6 months reported the same phenomenon. Time began to feel elastic. Minutes stretched into hours during the long watches between duties. Hours collapsed into seconds when the next task demanded attention. Days blurred together until the only way to track the passage of time was by counting the number of wick trimmings since the last supply run. But worse than the distortion of time was the way routine slowly erased personality. Keepers found themselves moving through their duties like automatons, performing each task with mechanical efficiency, but without conscious thought. They could trim wicks, clean lenses, and record observations while their minds wandered elsewhere, or went nowhere at all, existing in a state of wakeful emptiness that felt like drowning in slow motion. The isolation was made worse by the presence of another person. 2 men confined to a space measuring 60 feet in diameter at its widest point, with no privacy except what could be achieved by not speaking, which happened more often than the manual suggested was healthy. Conversations became functional. Pass the oil. Check the weather. Record the bearing of that ship. Personal revelations were dangerous because there was nowhere to escape them afterward. Humor required energy that men often did not have. Silence became a refuge, then a habit, then a problem of its own. James Murphy, one of the original keepers, kept a private diary during his 15 months on Devil's Teeth. The entries, discovered years later among his personal effects, reveal the gradual erosion of mental resilience under conditions that seemed manageable, but proved to be psychologically toxic. February 1875. Quote the sources. May 1875. Quote, 7. August 1875. Quote, 8. December 1875. Quote, 9. Murphy's replacement was Daniel O'Connor, a former ship's carpenter who approached lighthouse keeping with the methodical mindset of a craftsman. O'Connor lasted 93 days. His departure was sudden and unexplained. He simply walked aboard the supply boat one morning and refused to return to shore. The official report listed 10 as the cause, but O'Connor's final log entry was more revealing. 11. The third keeper was Thomas Byrne, a man with 8 years' experience on offshore installations. Byrne understood isolation, routine, and the mental discipline required to function alone. He also understood something that his predecessors hadn't grasped. The lighthouse was not just a workplace. It was a trap. The tower had been designed to contain everything necessary for survival: fuel, food, fresh water, tools, spare parts. But it also contained the men responsible for operating it, and there was no provision for escape except during scheduled supply runs that weather often delayed or cancelled entirely. During winter storms, when waves made boat travel impossible, keepers could be trapped on Devil's Teeth for weeks beyond their planned rotation. Byrne's letters to his sister in Dublin describe the psychological pressure of indefinite confinement. You wake each morning knowing that today will be exactly like yesterday, except that yesterday is one day closer to escape. But escape depends on weather that you cannot control, supply boats that may not come, and relief keepers who may decide, as others have, that this place asks too much of a man. The weather in particular became an obsession for every keeper who spent more than a few months on Devil's Teeth. Not because storms threatened their safety. The lighthouse was built to withstand anything the Atlantic could deliver, but because weather controlled their freedom. Clear skies meant supply boats could reach them. Rough seas meant isolation would continue. Keepers found themselves studying cloud formations with the intensity of meteorologists, searching for signs that their confinement might be ending soon. But weather also brought its own form of torture. Atlantic storms struck Devil's Teeth with violence that seemed personal and deliberate. Waves 40 feet high smashed against the tower's base, sending spray that reached the lantern room 100 feet above sea level. Wind speeds exceeded 100 miles per hour, creating pressure variations that made human ears ache and human balance fail. The tower swayed during severe gales, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to be felt as a constant, nauseating motion that continued for hours or sometimes days. Most disturbing was the sound. The lighthouse had been engineered to survive wind and waves, but the engineers had not considered what it would feel like to live inside a structure under constant acoustic assault. Wind moving through the iron framework created harmonics that resonated through the stone walls. Waves striking the base produced low-frequency vibrations that human ears could not hear, but human bodies could feel as anxiety, nausea, and a persistent sense of unease. Thomas Byrne described the acoustic environment in a letter dated March 1876, quote 13. The noise was particularly problematic at night, when keepers tried to rest between their 4-hour watch rotations. Sleep in the lighthouse was always partial, always interrupted by duties or sounds, or the simple awareness that the light must continue to burn regardless of human exhaustion. But sleep was also the only escape from the routine that dominated waking hours. When noise made sleep impossible, there was no refuge left. Byrne's final log entries document the progression from mild insomnia to chronic sleep deprivation to something approaching psychological breakdown. The handwriting becomes erratic. The language becomes disconnected. The observations become surreal. Counted 17 ships today, all moving in the same direction. Some of them were not there. On June 14, 1876, Byrne was found unconscious on the Lantern Room floor during a routine supply run. He was evacuated to Cork, where physicians diagnosed exhaustion and recommended immediate retirement from Lighthouse service. His replacement was already aboard the supply boat, ready to begin what the Board of Trade euphemistically called the learning process. But the learning process had revealed something that no one wanted to acknowledge. The Lighthouse was succeeding as a navigational aid while failing catastrophically as a workplace for human beings. The light burned every night. Ships navigated safely through black water. Insurance claims dropped. Commerce flourished. The men responsible for maintaining this success were being systematically destroyed by the conditions required to achieve it. Board of Trade officials, reviewing the pattern of rapid keeper turnover, attributed the problem to inadequate screening. They instituted psychological interviews for prospective lighthouse keepers, focusing on mental resilience, tolerance for solitude, and commitment to duty. The interviews were conducted by medical officers who had never spent a night in a lighthouse and based their assessments on criteria that sounded reasonable but proved to be irrelevant. The real problem was not the men being selected for lighthouse duty. The problem was the lighthouse itself. The tower had been designed as a machine for producing light. Every specification had been optimized for optical performance, structural durability, and maintenance efficiency. Human factors had been treated as secondary considerations, addressed through minimal accommodations that assumed lighthouse keepers would adapt to whatever conditions were provided. But human beings, unlike mechanical systems, do not simply adapt. They break down in predictable ways when subjected to prolonged stress, sensory deprivation, social isolation, and routine that eliminates personal agency. The lighthouse created all of these conditions simultaneously, then demanded that the men experiencing them perform precision tasks that ships depended on for survival. The mathematics were simple and brutal. High performance plus impossible conditions equals inevitable failure. By 1877, the pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Keepers lasted an average of 8 months before requesting transfer, abandoning their posts or suffering health problems that made continued service impossible. The Board of Trade was recruiting replacements faster than they could train them. Experienced maritime personnel were declining lighthouse positions despite premium wages. More seriously, the quality of lighthouse operation was beginning to suffer. Inexperienced keepers made mistakes that experienced men would have avoided. Log entries became sloppy as exhausted men struggled to maintain official standards. Light performance declined as rapid turnover prevented the development of expertise in lens maintenance and fuel management. The lighthouse was still functional. Ships still navigated safely through black water. But the system was operating with the brittleness of a machine running beyond its design limits, held together by will and luck rather than sustainable engineering. Something would have to change. The question was whether change would come through enlightened policy or catastrophic failure. The answer came during the winter of 1877, when a combination of severe weather and human error created the kind of crisis that makes headlines and forces institutions to confront problems they have been ignoring. The crisis began with a storm that meteorologists would later classify as one of the most severe Atlantic weather events of the 19th century. Hurricane-force winds sustained at over 90 miles per hour. Waves measuring 60 feet from trough to crest. Barometric pressure so low that lighthouse keepers reported physical pain in their ears and difficulty breathing. The storm lasted 9 days. During that time, no supply boat could approach Devil's Teeth. No communication was possible with the mainland. The lighthouse and its 2 keepers were completely isolated in conditions that tested the limits of both human endurance and structural engineering. The keepers were Michael Flanagan and Sean O'Malley, both experienced men who had served multiple rotations at various lighthouse stations. Flanagan had been on Devil's Teeth for 6 months. O'Malley was newer, but not new enough to be considered a liability. Under normal circumstances, both men were fully capable of maintaining lighthouse operations during severe weather, but these were not normal circumstances. By the 4th day of the storm, the lighthouse was experiencing stress that went beyond anything in the engineering specifications. The tower swayed constantly, creating motion sickness that made eating difficult and sleeping impossible. Wave impact against the base produced shock waves that traveled up through the structure, causing loose objects to vibrate off tables and shelves. Most critically, the acoustic environment had become unbearable. Wind moving through the iron framework at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour created a sound like continuous thunder. Waves striking the granite base produced percussion that felt like artillery bombardment. The spiral staircase amplified and focused these sounds into a cacophony that made normal conversation impossible and coherent thought extremely difficult. Flanagan's log entry for the 6th day consisted of a single line, quote, 16, quote. On the 7th day, human error compounded the natural crisis. O'Malley, disoriented by exhaustion and sensory overload, made a mistake during the routine wick trimming procedure. Instead of adjusting the flame to optimal brightness, he extinguished it entirely. In normal weather, this would have been a minor problem easily corrected. But during the storm, with the lens assembly vibrating from wind pressure and the oil reservoir sloshing from tower motion, relighting the flame proved unexpectedly difficult. For 47 minutes, the lighthouse was dark. During those 47 minutes, the steamship Belfast, carrying 32 passengers and a cargo of Irish wool bound for Liverpool, was approaching black water from the northwest. The captain, David MacLeod, had been navigating these waters for over 20 years and knew to look for the lighthouse beam as soon as Devil's Teeth came within visual range. When he saw no light, MacLeod assumed that atmospheric conditions were interfering with visibility. He continued on course, expecting the beam to appear as his ship drew closer. By the time he realized that the lighthouse was genuinely dark, Belfast was already within the reef zone, with insufficient room to maneuver safely in the heavy seas. MacLeod managed to avoid disaster through a combination of skill, luck, and intimate knowledge of the local waters. Belfast scraped bottom twice, but reached open water without serious damage. No one was injured. No cargo was lost. But the incident revealed how completely ships had come to depend on the lighthouse for safe navigation. Without the light, black water reverted instantly to its historical character, a ship-killing maze of reefs and currents that could claim lives without warning. O'Malley managed to relight the flame before Belfast's difficulties became fatal, but the psychological impact of the error destroyed what remained of his mental resilience. His final log entry, written after the storm had passed, was barely legible. Quote 17. When the relief boat finally reached Devil's Teeth, they found Flanagan alone. O'Malley had thrown himself into the sea sometime during the night after the storm ended. His body was never recovered. The official inquiry focused on operational procedures rather than systemic problems. New protocols were established for emergency lighting. Additional safety equipment was installed. Training procedures were revised to emphasize the importance of maintaining light discipline under all conditions, but the fundamental issue remained unaddressed. The lighthouse was still a machine designed without adequate consideration for the human beings required to operate it. The working conditions that had contributed to O'Malley's breakdown, prolonged isolation, acoustic trauma, chronic stress, responsibility for lives beyond counting, remained unchanged. The light continued to burn every night, Ships continued to navigate safely through black water. The system continued to function exactly as designed. And men continued to be slowly destroyed by the conditions required to maintain that function. By 1878, lighthouse keeping had acquired a reputation among maritime workers as employment to be avoided if possible, and endured only when no alternatives existed. Wages were increased, rotation schedules were shortened, medical benefits were expanded, but these measures addressed symptoms rather than causes. The real problem was architectural. The lighthouse had been designed as a machine for producing light, with human operators treated as interchangeable components rather than fragile biological systems with psychological needs that technology could not meet. No amount of money or medical care could compensate for living conditions that systematically undermined mental health and human dignity. But institutional momentum is difficult to reverse, especially when the institution is succeeding by its own metrics. The lighthouse worked. Ships were safer. Commerce prospered. These achievements were measurable and important. The cost in human suffering was harder to quantify and easier to ignore. The pattern would continue for another decade. Men recruited with promises of good wages and steady work. Men broken down by conditions that made both wages and work irrelevant. Men replaced by other men who would discover the same truths and suffer the same fate. The lighthouse had become a machine for consuming lighthouse keepers. And as long as the light continued to burn, the machine would continue to operate. The winter of 1879 arrived 3 weeks early. By November 15th, Atlantic storms were generating sustained winds of 80 miles per hour, with wave heights that made boat travel impossible for days at a stretch. The lighthouse keepers on Devil's Teeth, Joseph McKenna and Peter Walsh, were scheduled for relief on November 20th. The relief boat never came. McKenna was 34 years old, a former merchant seaman with 11 years' experience on cargo ships. He had requested lighthouse duty specifically because he was tired of long ocean voyages and wanted work that would keep him closer to Ireland. The irony was not lost on him that he now found himself more isolated than he had ever been aboard ship. At least ships moved. At least ships had destinations. Walsh was 28, unmarried, and had been keeping lighthouses for 3 years without incident. He understood the rhythm of the work, the importance of routine, the necessity of maintaining equipment regardless of personal comfort. What he was not prepared for was indefinite confinement with another man in a space that measured 18 feet in diameter at its widest point. The scheduled relief boat was the steamship Donegal, which had been making supply runs to Devil's Teeth twice monthly since the lighthouse opened. Captain Murphy knew these waters as well as any man alive, but even he could not negotiate the passage when waves exceeded 15 feet in height. The granite shelf that supported the lighthouse was barely accessible under ideal conditions. In heavy weather, boats attempting to dock faced the real possibility of being smashed against the rocks. On November 20th, when McKenna and Walsh looked toward shore, expecting to see the familiar silhouette of Donegal, they saw only empty water stretching to the horizon. The first delay was frustrating, but not alarming. Both men had experienced weather delays before. Lighthouse keepers understood that isolation was temporary, that relief would come when conditions improved. They had adequate supplies for an extra week. The light continued to burn every night. Ships continued to pass safely through black water. The system was functioning as designed. By November 27th, frustration had become concern. The barometer showed no sign of the high pressure that would bring clear weather. Radio contact with the mainland was impossible. The lighthouse was equipped for visual signaling only. McKenna and Walsh had no way of knowing whether relief boats were being delayed by weather or whether some other crisis had developed that might extend their isolation indefinitely. The psychological impact of indefinite confinement was immediate and severe. Human beings can endure almost any hardship if they know when it will end. But uncertainty about duration transforms routine discomfort into active torture. Every morning, McKenna and Walsh climbed to the lantern room, hoping to see a boat on the horizon. Every evening, they went to sleep, knowing that tomorrow might bring relief or might bring another day of waiting. The waiting was worse than the weather. By December 1st, both men were writing in their personal journals about the weight of the air inside the lighthouse. The tower felt smaller each day, as if the walls were slowly contracting. Conversations became shorter and more functional. Silence began to feel like a physical presence, something that followed them from room to room and settled on their shoulders like a lead cloak. McKenna's journal entry for December 3rd. The voices were not supernatural. They were the product of acoustic isolation in an environment where the only sounds were wind, waves, and the mechanical rhythm of each other's breathing. Human brains, deprived of normal auditory input, begin to manufacture sounds from internal neural activity. The phenomenon is well documented now, but in 1879, men experiencing auditory hallucinations had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. More disturbing than the hallucinations was the way routine began to break down. Tasks that had been performed with mechanical precision, wick trimming, lens cleaning, weather observations, started to require conscious effort. Both men found themselves standing in rooms with no memory of how they had gotten there, or staring at equipment for long minutes before remembering what they were supposed to do with it. Walsh's journal, December 5th. The light continued to burn, but barely. Both men were functioning at the minimum level necessary to maintain lighthouse operations. More complex tasks, detailed weather observations, equipment maintenance beyond basic cleaning, were abandoned entirely. The official logbook, which was supposed to record conditions every 4 hours, contained gaps that lasted for entire days. On December 7th, McKenna suffered what his journal describes as a source, quote 21. Walsh, who observed this breakdown, was unable to provide assistance because he was experiencing his own episode of psychological collapse. For an entire afternoon, both men were non-functional, leaving the lighthouse effectively unmanned. That night, the light went out. The reason was simple mechanical failure compounded by human error. The oil reservoir, which normally held enough fuel for 36 hours of operation, had been allowed to run nearly dry because neither keeper was maintaining accurate consumption records. When the level dropped below the minimum required for proper wick function, the flame flickered and died. Under normal circumstances, relighting would have been a routine procedure taking less than 10 minutes. But these were not normal circumstances. Both men were operating with severely compromised judgment, and the lighthouse systems that had been second nature to them now seemed impossibly complex. They spent 2 hours attempting to restart the flame, making mistakes that only compounded their difficulties. By the time they succeeded in relighting the beacon, Devil's Teeth had been dark for nearly 4 hours. During those 4 hours, the merchant vessel Prosperity was approaching black water from the southwest, carrying 43 passengers and a cargo of American grain bound for Dublin. Captain O'Sullivan had been expecting to see the lighthouse beam as soon as his ship reached visual range of the coast. When no light appeared, he assumed that atmospheric conditions were interfering with visibility. O'Sullivan continued on course, confident that his navigation was accurate and that the lighthouse would become visible as he drew closer to shore. By the time he realized that the light was genuinely dark, Prosperity was already within the reef zone, with heavy seas making maneuvering extremely difficult. The ship struck a submerged rock at 11:47 p.m., tearing a gash in the hull below the waterline. O'Sullivan managed to beach Prosperity on a sandbar, preventing total loss, but the vessel was a constructive total loss. More importantly, 7 passengers died during the evacuation, including 2 children. The lighthouse beam was restored just after midnight, too late to prevent the disaster, but early enough to guide rescue boats to the scene of the wreck. When the official inquiry convened in Cork 2 months later, the focus was on operational procedures rather than systemic problems. McKenna and Walsh were found guilty of dereliction of duty and dismissed from lighthouse service. New protocols were established for fuel monitoring and emergency procedures. Additional safety equipment was ordered for all lighthouse stations, but the fundamental problems that had caused the crisis remained unaddressed. The lighthouse was still a machine designed without adequate consideration for the psychological limits of the men required to operate it. The working conditions that had led to McKenna and Walsh's breakdown, prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, indefinite confinement, were unchanged. The Prosperity disaster marked a turning point in public perception of lighthouse operations. Newspapers across Ireland and Britain carried detailed accounts of the tragedy, focusing particular attention on the fact that 7 people had died because 2 men charged with maintaining a light had abandoned their posts. The coverage was brutal and largely unfair. McKenna and Walsh had not abandoned their posts. They had suffered psychological breakdowns brought on by conditions that would have broken most men. But public opinion was uninterested in nuanced explanations of human stress tolerance. People wanted simple answers to a complex tragedy. The Board of Trade responded with administrative changes designed to prevent similar failures. Lighthouse keeper rotations were shortened from 6 months to 3 months. Psychological screening was intensified. Emergency communication systems were prioritized for installation at isolated stations. These measures addressed symptoms rather than causes, but they were popular with a public that demanded action. More importantly, they were cheaper than the fundamental redesign of lighthouse operations that would have been necessary to address the real problems. By 1880, the pattern of lighthouse keeper breakdown and replacement had stabilized at what officials considered an acceptable level. Men were recruited, trained, assigned to lighthouse duty, and cycled through the system at a rate that maintained operational capability, while acknowledging the reality that not all keepers could withstand the psychological demands of the job. The lighthouse continued to burn every night. Ships continued to navigate safely through black water. The system worked, after a fashion, but it worked by consuming human beings at a predictable rate, grinding them up and disposing of them like any other consumable resource. The men who suffered psychological breakdown were classified as personnel failures rather than system failures. Their problems were treated as individual pathologies rather than predictable responses to impossible conditions. The true cost of lighthouse operations was hidden in the personnel files, recorded in the medical records of men whose careers and sometimes lives had been destroyed by service on Devil's Teeth. These costs were invisible to the shipping companies that benefited from safe navigation, invisible to the government officials who celebrated the success of lighthouse technology, invisible to the public that read newspaper accounts of maritime safety improvements. Only the lighthouse keepers themselves understood the real price of keeping the light burning, and most of them were too broken to speak about it coherently. The crisis of 1879 revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Lighthouse project. A system designed to save lives was systematically destroying the lives of the men responsible for operating it. But rather than resolving this contradiction, officials chose to manage it through administrative measures that made the human cost more predictable without making it smaller. The lighthouse had become a machine for breaking men. And as long as the light continued to burn, society was content to feed that machine a steady supply of fresh victims. By 1885, the average tenure of a lighthouse keeper on Devil's Teeth had dropped to 4 months and 12 days. This figure was considered acceptable by the Board of Trade, which had calculated that maintaining operational effectiveness required only that keepers remain functional long enough to train their replacements. The human cost of this calculation was documented in the medical records of 47 former lighthouse keepers treated at Cork Hospital between 1875 and 1885. 31 suffered from what physicians classified as nervous exhaustion. 16 experienced melancholic episodes severe enough to require institutional care. 8 attempted suicide, 3 succeeded. But these statistics were buried in bureaucratic files, accessible only to officials who had strong incentives not to examine them too closely. The lighthouse was a success story. It had reduced shipping losses in black water to nearly zero. Insurance rates had dropped. Commerce had flourished. These achievements were public and celebrated. The broken men were private and forgotten. The turning point came not through enlightened policy or public outcry, but through simple economics. By 1887, the cost of recruiting, training, and cycling through lighthouse keepers had become prohibitive. The Board of Trade was spending more money on personnel replacement than on lighthouse maintenance and fuel combined. More seriously, the pool of qualified candidates was shrinking as word spread through maritime communities about the psychological toll of lighthouse duty. Experienced seamen were declining positions on Devil's Teeth despite premium wages. The recruitment process was attracting increasingly desperate men whose qualifications were questionable and whose psychological stability was doubtful. The system was approaching operational failure, not because of enlightened concern for human welfare, but because it could no longer recruit adequate personnel to maintain basic function. Technology provided a solution. Automated lighting systems, powered by pressurized oil and regulated by clockwork mechanisms, could maintain lighthouse operations without requiring constant human intervention. The technology was expensive. Installation costs exceeded £10,000 per lighthouse, but it eliminated the need for permanent keeper stations at the most isolated locations. Devil's Teeth was among the first lighthouses selected for automation. The conversion was completed in October of 1888, 13 years after the lighthouse first began operating with human keepers. The automated system worked flawlessly. The light burned every night without fail. Ships navigated safely through black water with even greater reliability than before. The lighthouse achieved its operational objectives more effectively than it ever had under human management. But automation also meant abandonment. With no keepers to maintain the structure, Devil's Teeth began to deteriorate rapidly. Salt spray corroded the iron framework. Winter storms loosened stones from the tower walls. The living quarters, no longer heated or cleaned, became damp ruins where mold grew in geometric patterns on the walls. Within 5 years, the lighthouse had become uninhabitable. Within 10 years, it was unsafe for human occupation during routine maintenance visits. The tower that had been designed to last for centuries was already showing signs of structural instability. The cost of proper maintenance would have exceeded the cost of building a new lighthouse, but a new lighthouse was unnecessary because the automated system required only minimal upkeep to continue functioning. As long as the light burned, the deteriorating condition of the tower itself was irrelevant. By 1895, Devil's Teeth Lighthouse was a ruin. The automated beacon continued to operate, but the structure housing it was slowly collapsing. Holes had opened in the walls where mortar had washed away. The iron staircase was rusted through in several places, making access dangerous even for maintenance crews. Most symbolically, the living quarters where lighthouse keepers had suffered so much psychological trauma were now uninhabitable in the most literal sense. Water pooled on the floors during storms. ice formed on the walls during winter. Rats had colonized the lower levels, feeding on organic matter that had been left behind when automation made human occupation unnecessary. The rooms where men had slowly lost their sanity had become uninhabitable for any form of life. The lighthouse continued to function, but it was no longer a place where human beings could survive. The machine had evolved beyond any need for human intervention, leaving behind only the physical evidence of what it had cost to create. Devil's Teeth had become a monument to the price of progress measured in human suffering. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1896, delivered to the Board of Trade Officers in Dublin by a postal clerk who had no idea he was carrying the final chapter of a story that had been unfolding for over 20 years. The envelope was water-stained, the handwriting faded, but legible. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing 17 words that would close the books on one of the most successful lighthouse operations in British maritime history. Quote 25. The message was signed by Thomas Hartwell, Chief Inspector of Lighthouse Operations, who had made what would prove to be the final human visit to Devil's Teeth. His report, filed the same day, contained details that officials would have preferred to keep confidential. The automated lighting system had failed on March 8, 1896, when a combination of salt corrosion and mechanical wear finally overcame the clockwork mechanisms that had operated flawlessly for nearly 8 years. Repairs would have been possible if the lighthouse structure had remained sound, but 23 years of Atlantic weather had reduced the tower to a shell that was actively dangerous to enter. The iron staircase had corroded through in 4 places. The walls leaked continuously, creating ice formations that made footing treacherous. Most critically, the foundation had shifted during winter storms, creating cracks that ran from the base to the lantern room. Load-bearing stones had come loose, held in place only by the pressure of adjacent masonry. Hartwell estimated that the tower would collapse entirely within 2 years, possibly sooner if subjected to severe storm conditions. Any attempt to repair the automated beacon would require workers to enter a structure that could fail without warning, burying them under tons of falling stone. The economic calculation was brutal and simple. Repairing Devil's Teeth would cost more than building a new lighthouse. But a new lighthouse was unnecessary because shipping patterns had changed in ways that made the Black Water Passage less critical than it had been in the 1870s. Steamships with more powerful engines could afford to take longer routes that avoided the reef complex entirely. Improved navigation instruments made precise positioning possible even in poor weather. Most importantly, new lighthouses built at less challenging locations provided adequate guidance for the reduced traffic that still used the Black Water Corridor. Devil's Teeth had become obsolete, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too completely. The lighthouse had made Blackwater so safe that ships no longer needed to use it. Commerce had found easier routes, leaving the dangerous passage to local fishing boats that knew the waters well enough to navigate without lighthouse guidance. The decision to abandon Devil's Teeth was announced in a brief notice published in the Dublin Herald on April 3, 1896. The language was bureaucratic and final. Quote 26. No mention was made of the men who had lived and suffered and sometimes died to keep the light burning. No acknowledgement was offered of the psychological toll that lighthouse operations had extracted from dozens of keepers over 21 years of service. The human cost of the Lighthouse Project tour was erased from official memory as completely as if it had never existed. The light went dark on April 15, 1896, when the last of the oil in the automated system finally burned away. No ceremony marked the occasion. No official witness observed the final extinction of a beacon that had guided thousands of ships safely through one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the Irish coast. Devil's Teeth simply went dark, and stayed dark, and began the long process of returning to the sea that had always surrounded it. Within 5 years, the lighthouse was inaccessible even to maintenance crews. The wooden platform that had been used for supply operations had rotted away during the first winter after abandonment. The iron ladders bolted to the granite base had corroded to the point where they could not support human weight. Anyone attempting to reach the lighthouse would have to swim through water that was cold enough to kill in minutes, then climb wet stone surfaces using handholds that might crumble without warning. Devil's Teeth had become a forbidden place, cut off from the human world as completely as any location on Earth. The tower itself began to collapse in sections, starting with the lantern room, where the enormous Fresnel lens had been left in place when operations ceased. Winter storms in 1901 shattered most of the glass panels, allowing wind and rain to destroy the precision mechanisms that had once focused light across 30 miles of ocean. The lens assembly, which had cost £38,000 and represented some of the finest optical engineering of the 19th century, became a collection of broken glass and rusted bronze scattered across the stone floor. By 1905, the upper third of the tower had fallen into the sea during a particularly severe gale. The remaining structure was a truncated cylinder, barely 60 feet tall, its broken walls exposing the internal chambers where lighthouse keepers had once lived, worked, and slowly lost their sanity. Fishing boats passing Devil's Teeth reported strange acoustic phenomena. Wind moving through the ruined tower produced sounds that resembled human voices, screaming or calling for help. The reports were dismissed as imagination, fueled by knowledge of the lighthouse's troubled history, but they were frequent enough to acquire local legend status. Sailors began to avoid the area, not from fear of reefs or currents, but from an irrational discomfort that had no basis in navigation safety. The ruins of Devil's Teeth Lighthouse had become a place that felt haunted, even to men who did not believe in ghosts. The psychological legacy of the lighthouse proved more durable than its physical structure. Maritime communities along the Irish coast remembered Devil's Teeth not as a success story of engineering triumph over natural obstacles, but as a cautionary tale about the cost of progress measured in human suffering. Stories circulated about former lighthouse keepers who had never recovered from their service on Devil's Teeth. Men who drank too much and talked to themselves. Men who could not tolerate enclosed spaces or loud noises. Men who would begin shaking uncontrollably whenever they heard wind moving through buildings in ways that reminded them of the acoustic environment inside the tower. These stories were largely accurate. Medical records from Cork Hospital document a pattern of long-term psychological trauma among former Devil's Teeth keepers that persisted for decades after their lighthouse service ended. The men had been broken by their experience in ways that pre-industrial medicine could not heal and post-industrial society could not acknowledge. But the stories served a purpose beyond simple documentation of historical suffering. They became a form of institutional memory that prevented similar mistakes from being repeated. When new lighthouse projects were proposed during the early years of the 20th century, maritime workers would reference Devil's Teeth as an example of what happened when human factors were subordinated to engineering objectives. The cautionary tale was effective enough to influence lighthouse design for the next generation. Automated systems were prioritized not just for economic reasons, but to avoid creating working conditions that destroyed the men required to operate them. The lessons of Devil's Teeth had been learned, even if they were never officially acknowledged. By 1910, the ruins of the lighthouse were visible only at low tide, and only to observers who knew exactly where to look. Most of the structure had been claimed by the Atlantic, reduced to scattered stones that posed no threat to navigation and offered no guidance to ships. The site had reverted to its original character as an unmarked hazard in a dangerous stretch of water. Local fishermen reported that the granite shelf where the lighthouse had stood was gradually subsiding, worn away by 2 decades of wave action that was no longer deflected by the tower's mass. Within another generation, they predicted, Devil's Teeth would be completely submerged, invisible even at the lowest tides. The physical lighthouse was disappearing, but its influence on maritime safety policy was permanent. The disaster had demonstrated that some environments were simply incompatible with sustained human habitation, regardless of engineering sophistication or economic incentives. Some problems could not be solved by asking men to endure conditions that systematically destroyed their psychological health. This understanding led to fundamental changes in how dangerous or isolated installations were designed and staffed. Automation became the preferred solution, not just for economic efficiency, but for human welfare. Remote installations that required human operation were designed with rotation schedules, communication systems, and emergency evacuation procedures that acknowledged psychological limits rather than ignoring them. The men who had suffered on Devil's Teeth had not suffered entirely in vain. Their experience had taught lessons that would prevent similar tragedies at other installations. But those lessons had been learned through a process that treated human beings as experimental subjects in an uncontrolled study of stress tolerance. The ethical implications of this approach were never seriously examined by the officials responsible for lighthouse policy. The focus remained on operational effectiveness rather than human cost, on preventing system failures rather than preventing human suffering. As long as the lessons were learned and applied to future projects, the men who had been broken by Devil's Teeth could be classified as acceptable casualties in the larger campaign to make maritime commerce safer and more efficient. By 1920, when the last survivor of the original lighthouse keepers died in a Cork workhouse, Devil's Teeth had passed from living memory into historical documentation. The men who had experienced the psychological hell of lighthouse duty were gone, taking with them any first-hand testimony about what the experience had actually felt like. What remained were official records that documented operational procedures, maintenance schedules, and personnel statistics. The human dimension of the story was preserved only in scattered letters, diary entries, and medical records that were difficult to access and harder to interpret. The bureaucratic record was clean, efficient, and utterly sanitized of psychological reality. According to the files, Devil's Teeth had been a successful lighthouse that operated effectively for 21 years before being decommissioned for economic and structural reasons. Personnel turnover had been higher than optimal, but within acceptable parameters for a challenging assignment. The record made no mention of broken men, auditory hallucinations, psychological breakdowns, or suicide attempts. These inconvenient details had been classified as personnel matters rather than operational issues, filed separately and eventually forgotten entirely. History, as written by institutions, had a way of forgetting the human cost of institutional success. The ruins continued to subside throughout the 1920s and 30s until only the foundation stones remained visible at the lowest tides. Ships passed overhead without knowing they were traversing a graveyard of human ambition, engineering hubris, and bureaucratic indifference to psychological suffering. By 1950, even marine charts had ceased to mark the location of Devil's Teeth Lighthouse. The site had become just another patch of deep water in the Black Water Corridor, distinguished only by local fishermen who remembered stories their grandfathers had told about the tower that once rose from these waves. The lighthouse had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. But the pattern it established, the subordination of human welfare to technological achievement, the treatment of personnel as expendable resources, the assumption that men would simply adapt to conditions that systematically destroyed their mental health had become embedded in institutional thinking about dangerous or isolated operations. The lessons of Devil's Teeth were applied to Lighthouse design, but the underlying philosophy that had created the disaster remained unchanged. Future projects would be more careful about psychological factors, but only to the extent necessary to maintain operational effectiveness. Human suffering was still acceptable as long as it remained within manageable parameters. The machine had learned to consume human beings more efficiently, not to stop consuming them entirely. By the time the site was finally forgotten, the pattern had spread far beyond lighthouse operations. Remote weather stations, research installations, military outposts, and industrial facilities all operated according to principles that had been refined through the Devil's Teeth experience. The assumption that men could be conditioned to endure any environment had become fundamental to how dangerous work was organized and managed. The lighthouse was gone, but its legacy lived on in every isolated installation where human beings were asked to sacrifice their psychological health for operational objectives. The machine had evolved, but its appetite remained the same. Devil's Teeth Lighthouse had been designed to conquer darkness by projecting light across impossible distances. But its lasting achievement was to demonstrate how easily light could be extinguished by the systematic application of isolation, stress, and indifference to human suffering. The sea had reclaimed the tower, but the system that had destroyed the men inside it continued to operate, refined and perfected, in 1,000 different locations where the same logic still applied. Control without compassion creates failure by design. But institutions have excellent memories for technical lessons and amnesia for moral ones. The light had gone out. The machine lived on.